Everyone, Ernie Tech here, and welcome to the Computers of EPCOT. And not the computers nowadays, but the computers of yesterday. So back in the 80s, back in like, say, 1982, they had begun to think, well, we need to automate this place even more than we have. Disney had been using mainframe computer systems of a sort, not for much more than I think payroll and business processes. Now, I had been down to EPCOT not too long ago and realized that as a kid in the 80s, I wasn't interested. I mean, I was interested, but I wasn't really concentrating on anything like this, even though they had a lot of very interesting shows. One of the shows that they had was where they took their mainframe, their actual mainframe that existed at EPCOT, and they made it as part of one of the displays. And it was in a place that you went to as soon as you walked into Epcot, the big giant ball, as you went past there, Communicore it was called, and it was sort of a display or an environment that showed all sorts of fun showcases of technology. And they had the great idea that perhaps what we could do, we could just take the actual mainframe computer that we use as our daily driver, the actual thing itself, and we can put this on display and we can use a feature called Pepper's Ghost. Now, if you've ever been to the Haunted Mansion, you've seen Pepper's Ghost in action. And all it is that they project something that they want to be in the environment, but not really there. And they had this actor. This actor's name was Ken Jennings, and not the guy from Jeopardy, but he was an actor back in the 80s, and he was doing a song and dance routine that they called the Astuter Computer Review. And he would dance and sing and do all sorts of fun stuff. As you were walking by, he would be dancing on top of the equipment, but it was just his projection as a tiny little guy. And it was very interesting because at the time people were fascinated by this, but not very long. It wasn't a terribly long-lived show. I think the Astuter review only lasted for 2 years, but the actual displays might have lasted a lot longer. Let me show you what I mean. Let me just switch over here. I got to do a couple of things, as you know, when I go between videos and this goofy PowerPoint stuff. Hang on.
There now, that's more like it. You see, ECS, Entertainment Control System. X is the stage manager's right arm for all them large shows around it. He helps out by synchronizing lights and music to the parades and keeping track of their progress. But around here, computers always getting into the act. Especially then what does audio and magic. Watch closely now.
So that was the actual show, and you could see how the little projection worked. And it wasn't that popular. A lot of the things there were very much of the 80s. I don't think they would translate well into this current day. We just don't see things the way. It was very campy. It was very the kind of colors that they had back in the day. And I actually created this background using just some graphic stuff. That was the kind of muted colors, the pastels and stuff of the 80s. And they don't really translate as well today as maybe they thought they were going to. But anyway, the bottom line is that Disney had a relationship with Sperry. And Sperry had an 1100 series, which was a competitor to the IBM offerings. It may have been in the same time frame as the later Amdales. It was a relationship that Sperry was very eager to leverage for marketing. Sperry wanted to be sure that everybody knew that their relationship with Disney was a showcase. It was the pinnacle of their business acumen, and frankly, it was right. They were. Now, what Sperry was doing was it was using systems that it had developed internally for large companies, especially things that had a lot of movement of material, like railroads or airlines. And in this case, if you think about it, Disney wasn't a whole lot different because Disney was moving a lot of people. And so every single person was a transactional node. Every transaction associated with that person had to be managed, had to be tracked. Everything that had to be done in real time. And it's something that was developing at the time. And I'm not sure they understood this. as well as they do now, it was developing analytics, and the analytics that they really could leverage to determine what the people visiting Disney would want, what kinds of people, their income ranges, how much they spent, how much time they spent at each particular thing. The amount of information that was being collected was phenomenal, and I think only contemporarily in the last 10 years do we really understand the value of that, if you're into that kind of thing. Let me play another video here. The usual switching from one thing to another.
Beijing. When the sun rises here, it will also rise in Mexico and Morocco. This is EPCOT Center. And like the real world, it wouldn't wake up without Sperry computers. At Disney, fantasy is a very real business. And everything that helps management run the business runs on Sperry systems. Mickey Mouse is no fool.
So you can see that Sperry had spared no expense. I mean, they're getting Kirk Douglas to do these videos, and he wasn't the only guy. But what Sperry wanted to do was be sure that they were not going to lose this market to their competitors, whoever they were, more than just IBM, whoever in the situation they were in at the time. It could have been Amdale if the time frame, I think, was right. It could have been a number of the Japanese companies that were coming into play. It's something that Sperry was very keen on maintaining, and that is the alliance they had with Disney. Yeah, I usually foul this up, but I always do. So the 1108 processing system is what was active in the day. It was what was active within that system that you saw with the song and dance routine, the Astuter Computer review. I don't know whether or not they had created specific kinds of hardware, maybe the tables and the chairs and the desks, or whatever the case may be, the consoles. They may have done that specifically for Disney, or Disney may have done that themselves to create something that was much more interesting looking, but it was all Sperry in the background. So what do we know about this? Well, one of the things is that Sperry had its own operating system that was called Exec 8. And Exec 8, of course, did the same kinds of things that MVS does and different kinds of operating systems that we have played with. So the MTS operating system we're currently playing with in the same time frame as this, I'm making this, was an academic system designed mostly for universities and colleges. Same thing with Music SP. We haven't gotten to MVS, but MVS was a business environment, and so was Exec 8. And Exec 8 was specific to the Univac environment, and I have not been able to find, and I haven't looked too much because I don't think there's any value in finding a copy of Exec 8 that had open copyright or I could use, because it's not been listed as something that could run on Hercules. So I believe that the architecture was specific to the Unisys, the 1100 system. And one of the things that I get the impression that people were not happy with IBM's JCL, with the job control language, had this reputation for its complexity, as it says there, and a steep learning curve. And that is true, as we know. One of the things I had read in the journals that had been written over the years about MTS from the people that were involved in it. And one of the professors that was involved with it, one of the creators, was annoyed to no end about the complexity of MVS, IBM's operating system at the time, and he didn't think there was a necessity for it. And that's why he thought MTS was a better choice. Well, whatever the case may be, obviously, ZOS still exists. And there is a version of this Unisys operating system called OS 2200, which is currently, I believe, the OS used in the Unisys environment, which still exists. Unisys is still around. And it has an entire series of software to go with it. So it wasn't off on its own doing little tiny things that you could only just replicate there. It had the entire suite of things. So if you look at this here in that 80s period, you had Fortran, you had database systems, you had memory management system, paging obviously came a little bit later, extended mode for more memory, all the things that you would find. And as time went on, you can see that it introduced Java and so on. What I'm going to concentrate on right now is this little line here. Well, in a second. And then we get this little line here called Mapper. But before we do that, let's talk about Sperrylink. What Sperrylink was, it was an integrated environment for communicating within the Sperry hardware peripheral mainframe environment. And one of the things that Disney did was Disney took advantage of satellite communications because they had to communicate around the world the same way as railroads did, but they had to do it in very real time. They didn't have the luxury of knowing that when a consist of cars for, let's say, the Santa Fe Railroad got to Omaha, what to do with it in the yard. They needed to know what was going on with the people at that moment and that moment now, and it got even more important as time went on. And they also needed to be able to communicate with their mothership in Burbank, California. Now, I lived in California, in LA, back at this time period. I lived in Los Angeles in 1982. And there were only two big parks, and that was Disneyland and Knott's Berry's Farm. Knott's Berry's Farm. Whew, I need more coffee. Knott's Berry Farm. Well, anyway, if you were there, you know it was Knott's Berry Farm. Now, Knott's Berry Farm was fascinating. It was pretty big, but it was not what Disney had envisioned. Disney had wanted to make Disneyland, and Disneyland had been there since the 50s, and Disneyland needed a very robust system. In the early stages, of course, they used it for very specific things, payroll and so on. But in the case of moving people, they needed to have much more control. So they created Sperrylink. Sperrylink exists from Sperrylink, but they used that because that was what was going to keep up with the demands of moving all those people around Disney, and at the same time keeping track with everybody over in Disney World over in Orlando. We're not even into Tokyo and Paris yet. So they took advantage of Sperrylink. They took advantage of very expensive, extremely expensive satellite communication, landlines, local comm lines, you name it. Sperrylink was the vehicle for that, and pretty much looks like in a block diagram what you might have seen from IBM's controllers, communication controllers. In this case here, their terminals were named different. They had different kinds of terms for things, but in general, you had communication controllers, you had the lines, the interfaces, and so on. But it was all one happy family called Sperrylink. But the interesting thing was Mapper. Unisys Mapper: maintain, prepare, and produce executive reports. And so what Mapper was, it was not only a language that you could program in, it was an entire suite of tools, an entire suite of integrated software tools that would allow you to analyze the data that you were collecting. It would give you the resources to make executive decisions. You could produce all sorts of lovely reports, and people loved it. People just swore up and down about this. And there's actually a Unisys product now remains of Mapper called BIS, the Business Information Server. So Unisys still remains, and it still has this type of environment for its mainframes, whatever they offer. And this was what Disney based their environment, their business management environment on. And it looked like that, of course. But as they say, regardless of the magic in the Magic Kingdom, it's still a business, and a hardcore one at that, especially down in Orlando. If you ever get a chance to go down there, it will blow your mind. The amount of competition for your dollars is absurd, and it's getting more involved. So as Universal Studios continues to expand in their Harry Potter and stuff and all that kind of thing, and what Disney has done is Disney has dumped incredible amounts of money into certain franchises. One of them, of course, is Star Wars. So they have these interactive rides, one of which is called The Rise of the Resistance, which I was on and was incredibly impressed by, even though I'm not a Star Wars guy. But the amount of work it took to make this thing, the amount of work it took to manage the ride, the flow, the people, the whole thing is incredible. which is why that ride has the highest downtime of all the rides in Disney, because it may have gotten too big for itself. Anyhow, so Unisys still exists. Unisys is in Bluebell, PA. I believe that is their corporate headquarters. It's not too far from me. It's about an hour and a half drive from where I live up in the concrete continuum. I don't think you can show up at its front door and go to a gift shop or a coffee shop. I don't think it's designed for that. So there's no reason for me to venture over there as some kind of investigation. But I think it would be worth doing some videos about Unisys, about Sperry Rand, about Burroughs, and about what they did as far as mainframes. So I'm going to include those in the things that I create about our little mainframes. So it still exists. It still has a series of mainframe systems that it produces, and it still has its operating systems, and it has a very niche market, except I'm not really too sure what that market is, but it's still around. One more of these things. Now, this is an interesting one because this is the one that I took. So I was on this ride. I'm sitting next to my wife, and all the rest of the family is spread out all over this ride. And of course, when we got to this, everybody looked at me like, oh, please don't embarrass, don't stand up or something. But this was fascinating. Have a look at this. Let me go through the little gyrations here of turning one mic off and one mic on. Okay. That was Judy Dench, by the way, narrating this, and it's inside the big ball, the big EPCOT ball, I call it. I know there's a name for it, Spaceship Earth, but I call it the ball. And it's a ride that you get in. You sit in the car. It's very soft and gentle. It doesn't swing you around or anything like that. But it takes you through the times, like the human history. You start out with people who were painting on the walls inside of caves, and then eventually you make it to here. And this is a tribute to its mainframe environment. I would probably have a good time in there making these, working on these kinds of projects. And then eventually you get to the point where you're launched into space and you're out there. You get the gist. On one side of the track was this, which was the guy in the white coat. Now, I assume guys in white coats in the mainframe environment so they could keep the dirt from getting in the machine. Makes sense, right? On the other side of the track was a mannequin, a moving animatronic of a young lady who was working at a terminal and going over reports. So that's their homage to the mainframe. Let me flip over here without. I know what I'm going to do. I did it. Yep. I always do that. One of these days I'll figure out how not to do that, but it's not going to be today. So that is my little exploration, and little it was, into the Sperry Rand Univac environment that has found its way into the history of Disney and in the history of EPCOT as an actual a display, an actual, you can't call it a ride, I guess, but it was a display. And how Unisys became, or Sperry, Univac became the go-to environment for Disney because of its, I guess, its integration with its Sperrylink, with its integration with its Mapper suite. Perhaps Sperry was smart enough to provide economic incentives and reasons for Disney to go there. And one gets the impression that people are not particularly pleased with having to learn JCL. I'm not sure that that was a big deal, but seems to have been. Okay, well, anyhow, that was fun. I hope you enjoyed it. A little aside from our watching characters go across green terminal emulator screens. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments, anything, just drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say, what you think about this. All right, subscribe, please, if you haven't so far. I sure appreciate it. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.